Men are good, as are you. Yes, indeed, they are good. And I'm Tom Golden, and I'm here with Aman Siddiqui. And you may remember Aman from the last video we did on the Prejudice Against Men and his dissertation, that beautiful dissertation, A Clinical Guide to Discussing Prejudice Against Men. Read it. Read it. It's absolutely amazing. But today we're going to talk about just a part of that dissertation, the part about prejudice against men. How is it maintained? What is it our culture does that maintains that prejudice, that keeps men in a state where the prejudice is invisible yet powerful? So, Aman, where do we start? Where do we go?
Okay, so today we're going to focus in just on a few parts, but an overall summary of how it works is it sort of goes in levels. First, the society as a whole is kind of kept ignorant about the things that men are experiencing. And
Yes,
that's the whole one section.
yes,
The second section is if you try to bring up any of the topics that are affecting men, they will be denied in a variety of different ways. And
yeah,
that's the section we're probably going to focus in. But just to give a quick summary, if something can't successfully be denied, then it's often trivialized, minimized. It's no big deal. Why are you worrying about this nonsense? If that doesn't work, it moves to the justification phase. It's okay because of this, or they deserve it, or whatever. And the very last stage is intimidation. And so that's, if someone still won't shut up after all of those things, they might just be attacked straight out.
yes,
And this is
yes,
most likely the level in which many prejudice, honestly, in society are maintained. But
yes,
we are just outlining it specifically for men.
yes,
So, the first way that often prejudice against men may be denied is just directly, just direct denial. And that sounds funny to some people, but if you work in therapy, I'm sure Tom can tell you that sometimes people are going to just deny something. Aliens could come from the sky and be right in front of you, and you could still say we're the only people in the universe.
yes,
And there are a few different ways in which people can do that. But in a nutshell, you can be saying something, you can be showing them facts. I've actually spoken with a PhD in economics, and I showed him 20 different articles, and he still refused to acknowledge that domestic violence against men existed or that it was more than a minor thing. And I kept showing him article after article, right?
right,
Um, but then what's more kind of dangerous, you could say, is that there are a lot of indirect methods that people use to sort of sidestep or avoid people from talking about the issue. And so those are
yes,
kind of indirect denial methods. They
yes,
kind of fall in three categories. One is sort of a description of this can't be happening. Forget if it is happening. I'm going to give you some sort of argument of why it can't happen.
right,
And that sort of digresses the conversation into a different area. Another one is this isn't really prejudice. I'm not denying that the thing is occurring, but I'm denying that it's a form of prejudice.
right,
Right. So these are usually in the form of arguments or discussions, the kind of things you read in books or retorts people give. And the last one is a form of avoidance, a way of sort of just getting away from the topic in one way or the other. Um, so, a couple examples of the first one, which is an indirect form of denial, where you just say it can't be happening. A popular thing people probably have heard is that men have all the power in society, therefore they can't suffer discrimination, right?
right.
You might be listing things they're suffering, you're telling them, but instead of directly addressing the things you're saying, they just say this overall thing, men have all the power, therefore it's just not possible, right? Um, so, without getting, you could give a lot of specific examples, but just as a whole, that argument is sort of inherently irrational. And the way I decided to address that is to sort of go step by step and explain to people why that doesn't really make sense. And when they go through it, even people who are sort of used to endorse that method have told me, okay, I'm starting to see that now.
Yes,
The first one is that that's a form of people use a form of cherry picking, right? You will choose only areas or examples where maybe men do have more power and conveniently ignore all the areas in which men have less power or no power, something like this, right?
right, right,
So the argument itself is based on the cherry picking logical fallacy.
yep,
The second one is that just because men have power in a situation doesn't mean it's benefiting them. There's this assumption that power is always good, you know. For example, if someone is the primary breadwinner of a family, we assume that this means they have power and somehow they're benefiting. But the breadwinner has a lot of stress. They have a lot of pressure. They have to give up their dreams. They have to work constantly. I mean, would you say that the captain of an aircraft carrier is responsible for the lives of 5,000 people? Yeah, sure, he has power, but I'm sure he or she will tell you it's not an easy job, and I'd love to not have it. I have all that weight on my shoulders.
Yes.
So there's
Yes.
this assumption that if you have power, somehow you're benefiting.
Yes.
The third is this idea that if some men have power, that means all men have power, right? If the majority of CEOs in the country and the president is a man, all men now have power.
Right.
Somehow, a man who's working 16 hours a day in a mine because he's been made to be responsible for the financial benefit, prosperity of his family, is somehow benefiting from the fact that the president happens to be a man, or that many CEOs are men. It's irrelevant, right? It's a small
Yep.
group of people.
Yes.
It has nothing to do with the rest of society. So we're going like I'm going in a fast way, but it's better, of course, when you read it all laid out. It sort of penetrates a little better when I wrote about it. I give examples of each one, so I know I'm kind of going rapid fire. But the idea is, when you see how many reasons there are that an argument is irrational, you start to say, let me forget. Because if you hear it at
Yes.
face value, men have power, so obviously they couldn't be the victims of something. It seems like it makes sense until you get some critical thinking on the issue.
Yes. Yes. Exactly.
So the fourth kind of I wouldn't say response, but even just understanding of that is that power in some domains doesn't mean you have power in all domains. Again,
Right.
this is a form
Right.
of cherry picking.
Yes.
Um, so even if a specific person has power in certain situations, it doesn't mean they have power in all circumstances all the time, right?
Right.
So, I mean,
Right.
if this is looking at it at an intra-individual thing.
Yes.
Um,
The
then
commander
the
of the
hmm.
aircraft carrier would have power over the 5,000, but if his wife said no sex tonight, he'd be powerless, right?
Exactly. And so it's like, even a person who has power in some circumstances, they're not somehow all powerful,
Right.
all everything now, right?
Right.
So
Right.
the first part was that looking as a whole, and now at the individual level.
Yes.
Now the fifth and sixth ones are interesting. They have to do what's called, we haven't actually talked about any of the forms of prejudice yet. It's funny, we kind of are delaying that to later. But a couple things that we talk about are things about around something called the agency bias and attribution biases. So the fifth and sixth reasons kind of touch on those. The fifth one is men are not powerful just because other people view them as powerful, right? Even the evaluation of who you think is powerful. One of the forms of discrimination that men face is kind of referred to as speaking for men, on the behalf of men. I'm going to tell you what men experience. I'm going to tell you what men feel, even if they say the opposite.
Hmm.
Either I'm a woman who's speaking for all men, or even if I'm a man who's speaking for all men, but I have a very, misandristic viewpoint. I'm going to tell you what all men are feeling. So, if we take, say, the breadwinner example, if someone else wants to describe the so-called head of a family as being powerful, if you ask him, maybe he will say, I don't have any power. I had to give up all of my dreams. I'm a
Right.
slave not only to my job but to my
Exactly.
family. If I don't
Exactly.
provide the money, I'll end up in divorce and lose my kids.
Yes.
So other people deciding for certain men that they're powerful, ignoring their own testimonies.
Yes.
And so speaking for men is actually a quite pervasive problem. For example, it comes up in victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. We actually have academics who are publishing so-called peer-reviewed articles claiming that men never suffer when they're victims of domestic violence. And I talked about that to some degree in the dissertation, that it's just a laughable scenario. Did they interview the victims and the victims told them that it was laughable, or they have decided it's laughable and decided from all the victims that they know what they felt? So
They're
this is coming
speaking
up
for
now.
men.
Right,
Yep.
right. Speaking on behalf of them.
Yep.
And so similarly, the sixth one is, men are not powerful in a situation just because women feel powerless. It's
Right.
not a zero sum game.
Right.
I've often been told by people. Oh, women have told me walking home at night is so scary. You don't have to deal with that. And I say, why don't I have to deal with it? I could get mugged or robbed too. Oh, no, no, no. Women, you don't understand. Women are always afraid. I said, great. I'm not denying that. What, men are also afraid. No, no, no. Nothing will happen to you.
Right.
Of course, we know statistically that men are the victims of violence far, far greater. I mean, it's not even close.
Right.
It's highly unlikely, in fact, that a woman walking home will get attacked as compared to a man. I mean, men are the victims of violence in every form of violence at higher rates. It doesn't mean it's unlikely that a woman might be, but the idea that somehow it's less likely for a man is just not statistically accurate.
It's
So there's the
irrational.
idea that because I'm scared, you must not be scared. Because I'm in danger, you must not be in danger, which is just factually incorrect. I mean,
Right.
that's why men are asked to walk a woman home at night. But who walks the man home from the girl's door to his house? Oh,
Yeah.
he'll be fine. Why will he be fine? I don't understand that. So
Yeah.
just because a woman feels powerless in a situation, and maybe she is, doesn't mean all of a sudden we should say the man has all the power. Maybe it's a situation where no one has power. This happens a lot in an Orientalist view of third world countries. They will
Hmm.
talk about the plight of women in those countries, which is all accurate. But the plight of men in those countries is also very bad. They're not somehow kings lording over things. They're all suffering.
Yes. Yes.
So I
Huh.
know this was a lot of dense information,
That's
but it's just
fascinating, though. It's fascinating. The whole idea of this is so easy to say men have all the power.
hmm,
But when you break it down like you did with those six things, it
hmm,
starts to crumble, you
hmm,
know? And this is the kind of thing that men out there watching
hmm,
can use and hold on to. And the next time someone pulls that bullshit, of that men have all the power, they can start whittling away at it. So, in my mind, that's part of the beauty of what we're doing today is it's giving men tools to be able to confront this kind of thing.
yeah,
So,
exactly.
good stuff.
I mean, my plan for the future, currently I have some other things on my plate, but the reason I want to convert the dissertation to more of a book for the popular press is partially what you said. Right now it's kind of dense, it's designed for academics, etc. But I want to reframe it as tools for everyone to use. And
Yes.
not necessarily, not everyone, it's not always, one side versus the other. In reality, probably 90% of the population is just open to whatever they're being told. If you remember, the first form of maintenance, the first maintenance mechanism was ignorance. That society is being kept ignorant, and often when I explain things in a very clear way, people will say, "Oh, you know what? I never knew that.
Right.
Thanks for telling me."
Right.
The problem
Yes.
is we often engage with the most antagonistic, misandristic people there are and hope to change their minds. So we have this view everyone's against men. Um, there's a small group that is against men, and then the
Yes.
rest of the population will just listen to whoever tells them what.
Yes.
So it's just a way, even
I
even a neutral
quite
person.
agree. I
Hmm,
quite agree. The workshops I've given over the years, it convinced me that women really want to know about men. They
hmm,
really do. Most of them, there's about 5% that completely have lost their
hmm.
minds, that hate men, basically. But most women, and it's important for us to realize that there are some good women
Hmm.
out there.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about this often in the psychology community, which has become predominantly female,
Oh boy.
and male or female people can be very misandristic,
Yes, yes,
and so,
absolutely.
but 90% of all of them, like you said, are open to hearing these ideas, and so that's sort of the idea of the book for someone who wants to learn or someone who wants to tell others. Um, so the next section, I guess I mentioned, is so we're talking about indirect ways in which prejudice against men is denied,
Yes.
and that's in my experience the most common kind of response that comes up when you bring it up, right? When you talk about an issue, the first thing they'll go to is denial, and unless it's a situation where they can just deny it's happening, usually it's one of these kind of indirects. So the first category we mentioned was sort of like reasons it just couldn't be happening. I'm gonna just deny if it's happening or not. The next one is like, this is why it's not prejudice. It's happening, but it's not a form of prejudice, right? There's a few of those. One is like, if that policy or viewpoint or even law is approved by those in power. right? If the government says so, it must be okay. If the academic society is saying so, it must be okay. If everyone in general is saying it, it must be right. Which is, of course, inherently irrational. That would mean that there was never any prejudice in the world because society always endorses various prejudices, right?
Yes.
We
And
wouldn't
not
say,
just that, but in your dissertation, you're very clear about the different ways that people have gotten things wrong over the years. you
yeah,
know?
exactly. I mean, trusting the government or society as a whole, I mean, does that mean that somehow, slavery was never wrong when society as a whole was approving it? I mean, it was always wrong, right?
Yeah, that
So,
example you gave in the dissertation about the slaves, I think, was just perfect.
yeah,
The
and I actually go through, I think, a bunch of Supreme Court decisions which upheld discriminatory policies, and then later versions of the Supreme Court struck them down. So if
yes,
the Supreme Court was at that time endorsing it, so um,
yes.
I'm told very frequently when I talk about men's issues by people who aren't ready to accept it, they'll say, "But this is what the research says," and by research they. Some people may know they're referring specifically to only to the APA Division of 51 because all research doesn't support that. Just this one niche group, but they
right.
have a lot of power because they are
Yes.
part of the
Oh
APA.
boy, they do.
And so they're not. If you notice, they're not denying or refuting or even having any response to the thing I may have just said. They just say, "But the APA isn't saying it."
Right.
So this
Right.
is why it's a form of indirect denial.
Way to turn it
Yeah,
off.
exactly
Well, the
like that.
smart people don't believe that.
Right, exactly.
And
So
I
of course,
listen to the smart people.
another example of this type of denial would be just sort of saying, well, men are like that, you're just saying it's not a form of prejudice because it's true. And that's something that's been
Huh.
used against many groups, they will just say, oh, but it's a circular reference. It's not prejudice because that group is like that. Well, why do you believe it's like that? Oh, because I think so. It's just like this kind of thing, right?
Yes. Yes.
Um, and so another popular one is this idea of men can't suffer sexism because sexism is specific. The word sexism itself is specific to women, and it's a form of institutionalized prejudice, etc. It's a very common thing. Now, there's a few responses, or not responses. I don't want to frame it as it's a debate. There's a few reasons that's irrational. Okay, one is that's a form of distraction, right? You're moving the person away. You didn't tell me this discrimination isn't happening. You just don't like the term the person used.
Right.
Well,
Right.
so if the person was genuinely believing that the word sexism only applies to women, then their response should be something like, well, technically, what you said isn't sexism because it's for a man, but it's still a very bad form of discrimination. Therefore, we should engage with it,
Right.
which is
Right.
of course not what's happening.
No.
They're focusing in on this one term as a way to redirect the whole conversation
Yes.
away from what you're talking about, right?
Yes.
If you said something like, if I just use an example, men are the only ones subjected to the military draft, and that's sexist. Oh, it can't be sexism because that's only for women. Okay, but the topic was about men. That doesn't mean men aren't the only ones being subjected to this, or that that's okay, right? It's a way of diversion,
Right.
and that's why it's an indirect form of denial. So
Yes.
this is why the dissertation is on the psychology of prejudice against men.
Yes.
Understanding why it exists in the world if it's so bad. Because there's
Yes.
these, if you want to call them tricks, mind games that people are using.
Yes.
Um, and so there are a variety of kind of more details about why the term sexism really, or why focusing on that term is not really rational. I don't necessarily want to go through all of them because it can get a little complicated. But one thing that's a simpler one to think about is that only becomes relevant when someone is trying to deny the thing men are going through. So for example, um, that is not really part of the original definition of sexism. It's also, like I said, sort of irrelevant to whether or not the thing is happening. It's just sort of highly focused on as a way to avoid talking about the thing you just brought up. So I don't want to go through the whole analysis, but you should sort of frame that as a distraction technique, as like a red herring, if you will, a
Yes.
way to get you off the topic. They want to start engaging with you on a term instead of the thing you mentioned.
Right.
So, for example, you could say, okay, whatever, sure. Then I'm talking about prejudice, but let's get back to the issue I was talking about. You see,
Yes.
that's a debate tactic people use. They try to control where the conversation goes
Yes.
away from the content.
Yes.
Um, and there was one other thing I was going to say, and then I forgot it. Oh, yeah. And so, if you notice, the topic of my dissertation is prejudice against men. So, although it's completely false that men can't experience sexism, I avoid having to go through this discussion with each and every person by not using the word. So I had to adapt. When I submitted my first rough draft to my advisor, this
Huh.
is actually what she said. She said it can't be, but that men can't experience sexism.
Oh shit.
Yeah, and
Oh
so
shit.
I tried to frame that. Tom can tell you that sometimes you face resistance in therapy, and you shouldn't frame it as the person's fighting you. You should frame resistance or understand resistance or defensiveness as them telling you something. They're not ready to hear what you're saying or the way you're
Yes.
saying it. So you
Yes.
have to, as a therapist, you have to adjust your approach. Not every It doesn't mean that they want to block you out. You have, and so I. It was tough. I'll admit you. It took me a couple weeks. I was upset.
Really? What
I
did you
said, "Is my whole
do?
dissertation going to be a failure?" But I decided to reframe it. I said, first of all, it inspired me to write the whole section on why saying men can't experience sexism is
Huh.
a red herring and a form
Huh.
of indirect denial. And in
Yes.
fact, perhaps it inspired the whole concept of maintenance mechanisms. It
Yes.
was like 4 years ago when this happened.
Huh.
But also, I said, let me make some adjustments. So, first thing I did is I just said, okay, if that's a triggering word, I don't have to use the word. I don't want that emotional trigger or that automatic thought to get in the way of the person listening to what I'm saying. So
Yes.
it's not really like you could say giving up your values. It's just an acceptable adjustment made to consider the reality of the environment you're living in, right? There's
Yes.
something called social judgment theory where they use anchoring. And anchoring is often used with numbers, but anchoring in opinions means you can only discuss something that's a certain distance away from the opinion the person already has.
Interesting.
If you talk about something way out of here in left field, so far from the way the person views the world, they're just going to deny it. They're not going to be able to process it.
Yes.
And if you suggest an opinion that's very small in difference, they will say it's meaningless, the difference. So you need to only discuss a way of viewing something that is a moderate distance from where someone
Yes.
already is thinking.
Yes. That reminds me of the backlash. Was it backlash that it's called? Backfire effect that you talk
Hmm,
about, which
exactly, the backfire
fascinated me.
effect. Yeah, when you try to propose contradictory evidence to someone who has a very strongly held belief, it only encourages them to believe that more. It doesn't
Yes.
discourage them.
Yes. Yes. I
People
found
see
that
that like in
fascinating.
political analyses and things like this. Um, so in general, so you may be arguing for an opinion that is not 100% what you believe, but it's at least better than where the person was. Instead of always saying the most extreme version of your belief, and then two polar opposites are just fighting against each other, and you see that in debates,
Not
right?
just that, but the fight actually is pushing them farther away. I mean, they're
Exactly.
believing their own lie even more because they're hearing contradictory evidence,
Right.
which I've seen before. I hadn't even thought about it until I read your dissertation. It's
Hmm.
fascinating stuff.
So I was actually really encouraged when I defended my dissertation. My advisor was very nice. She was extremely positive and supportive. She was saying how this dissertation is so important and I'm so glad it was done. And I was kind of shocked, because I
Yeah.
remember it from 3, 4 years earlier.
Huh.
And also my second reader was also somewhat negative to the topic. And they were both very so by the time, so my point is, when you write it in a way that takes into account the barriers people have, the preconceptions they have, and help them get from A to B, even someone who's very opposed to you can eventually become an ally. My second reader actually gave a talk on men's issues, and he
Oh
always talks
shit.
from the he always gives the talk from the Division 51 perspective.
Yes.
I've actually talked to him about that, but he hasn't changed. However, the last time he gave the talk, he referenced my dissertation. He told people how, useful it was. He spoke positively about it.
How about
Whereas in the
that?
day one, he was opposed to the whole thing.
Aman, you're going to be a good therapist.
So this is just more of an overall discussion. I guess we got on a bit of a tangent about, the way you would talk to people about men's issues, but it sort of was related to this triggering event about sexism.
Yes,
It is
yes,
true that that term is in no way specific to women, which I go into the details in the dissertation. But at
yes.
the same time, every single point doesn't have to be argued with people all the time.
Right.
You want to focus on the
Exactly.
main thing. If they're
Choose your
using that as a
battles.
way to distract you from the actual issue because you used one term, you just say, okay, fine, it wasn't sexism, it was a severe form of prejudice. Can we get back to the topic at hand?
Yes, yes.
Um,
One of the things I've always found helpful is when someone is defensive about men having pain, I'll just say, are you having a little trouble mustering a little compassion for men and boys?
hmm.
Because when it's framed like that, people go, "Oh no, I'm not. I'm compassionate for men and boys." Oh, good. Well, let's talk about this.
This is terrific. Yeah, exactly. It's sometimes hard. I guess Tom and I have a bit of advantage because you have to learn to modulate your own emotions and learn how to say things when you work in therapy.
And
But
you
it's
have to
hard to put that on every
detach,
other person. Yeah. You
detach,
know,
detach, detach.
if you're being triggered by the responses of the other person, it's very natural. I wouldn't fault anyone,
Oh
but
boy.
it's also less effective, is the problem.
Yes, yes, exactly, exactly right.
So the last category we come to is sort of the main thing we were going to originally talk about, but I went on and on about the whole structure. So one of the forms of indirect denials is when you try to just avoid the topic, which is sort of a little bit similar to what we were just talking about. But you just sort of someone might bring the conversation somewhere else. A few examples are sometimes when you bring up an issue men are facing, the person's response will say, "Yeah, but women face this other issue," which may be true, but is irrelevant. This is a way
Right,
of avoiding. There was in the Red Pill, I believe, there's a scene where the editor of a very popular magazine is being interviewed, and
right.
the interviewer asks her about subjecting men only to the military draft, and her response was, women have been excluded from certain military positions for years. I mean, this is true and also possibly negative, but irrelevant, right? It's a way
Yes,
of saying,
yes,
actually, women are the victims. You shouldn't be talking about men. It's not relevant. Let's talk more about this.
yes,
The interviewer wasn't denying that that may or may not have happened. So that's one thing called gynocentric redirection.
yes.
Redirect the topic somewhere else. Another example is focusing on the perpetrator instead of the victim. You
Right.
know, it doesn't matter if men experience this. Let's talk more about who did the thing, for
Yes,
example, right?
yes. And it must have been
Um,
a man.
it must have been a man, or
Yeah.
even if it wasn't a man, we're going to redirect the conversation away
Right.
from male victims of prejudice onto something else,
Yes.
often the one who perpetrated it.
Yes.
And now the last one, the main one we want to talk about is, of course, blaming the victim,
Yes.
which is, of course, something you see in a lot of situations and always bad.
Yes. And it's a feminist. They use it all the time. This they blame. Oh, you're blaming the victim, blaming the victim. But wait till you hear what Aman has to say about this.
So, I mean, in general,
Oh boy.
this is something that men experience quite a lot. And when I've talked
Yes.
about it with psychologists, they will use the term before even me. They will say this is victim blaming.
Right.
Male victims of domestic violence and sexual assault are almost exclusively blamed. What
Yes.
did you do to cause so and so to hurt you?
Yes.
Why didn't you stop it?
Yes.
Um, there's actually, a lot of people, some people may remember that, I'm forgetting his name, but there is an actor who came out about his sexual assault that he experienced at a Hollywood party, and he
Huh.
testified in front of Congress. Terry, I'm blanking on his name. He's like a very muscular guy. I think he's on the American Idol or one of those, not American Idol, one of those shows.
Right.
Anyways, he was very popular for a while, not popular, but he was going on a lot of places sharing his story, which is a great thing. But when he was testifying in front of Congresswoman Feynman, I believe is her name. If that's wrong, I'm sorry. I'm just I didn't review this part, but she specifically asked him, "You're a big guy. Why didn't you just stop him?" Now she's talking to a victim of sexual assault, and only because he's male, and only because he himself is particularly a very large, muscular guy, she's asking why he didn't. What essentially saying, this is definitely an indirect way of saying this is your fault. She would
Right.
never in a million years have said this to a woman. And I agree that it shouldn't be said to anyone. It's good that she wouldn't say it to a woman. But it was a very normal thing. No one gasped. Nobody thought it was strange, and he was forced to respond. He was forced to respond to her. Um, and so blaming the victim is a very common trope, if you will.
Yes.
Um, and there are two ways in which that is extra common. And the fact that it's blaming the victim is denied. So not
Correct.
only are they denying the prejudice against men, they're denying that this is an example of victim blaming.
Right.
One is blaming patriarchy.
Amen.
Oh, it's not, in the old days, in the maybe 70s and 80s, it said men are the cause of all the problems in the world. Now they have gotten so much pushback, they have adapted this to patriarchy is the cause of all the problems in the world, right? And it affects men and women, you could say.
Right.
Um, this is definitely a form of victim blaming. Um, there's a few reasons for this. One is there is no definition of what patriarchy means, no one definition, right? The original definition, the only genuine one, is that it just describes a family unit in which the father is the primary person responsible for decision making. That's all it means. So, as we mentioned earlier, that's not necessarily a good thing, right? As we covered earlier, being the one responsible for everything doesn't mean you're benefiting. You have all the pressure, you have all the stress, you have all the responsibility. If anything goes wrong, it's your fault. If the family doesn't have enough money, it's your fault. So, being the so called leader of a family in a patriarchal system in no way benefits men. But putting that to the side, that's really all patriarchy means. What's happened is over the past few decades, this definition has evolved into something that's completely, not really supported by evidence. Now it's sort of defined as a system where men dominate women by forcing male and female gender roles on everyone. This is the way people use it. I mean, they don't say that definition, but when they say, I want to fight the patriarchy, I mean, they don't mean I just want the husband not to make all the decisions. They're implying that there's this overall systematic thing in which men are forcing all these different gender roles on both men and women. And
Yes.
this is a definition that was basically fabricated by academics. It has nothing to do with the original meaning of patriarchy. And because, as I pointed out, the original meaning of patriarchy doesn't necessarily benefit men, and it doesn't have anything to do with gender roles. There's this assumption that somehow men are in charge of all the gender roles. They decide, or patriarchy, I should say in this case, they'll claim patriarchy decided. I mean, patriarchy has nothing to do with gender roles. Gender roles have existed in society for thousands of years. They are different in each society. Who is leading the family is an example of a gender role. It's not somehow enforcing all gender roles. It's what we call an illusory correlation. There's no relationship between patriarchy existing or not and various gender roles being enforced. Gender roles are created by everyone in society collectively, not one group, and they are enforced by everyone in society collectively.
Right.
Patriarchy, you could say, is one example of a gender role. So this idea that somehow it's responsible for all the gender roles is, just empirically almost nonsensical. So it's basically a form of smokescreen to continue blaming men. You
Yes.
just use a different term, essentially.
Exactly. Exactly. It's like putting cellophane that says patriarchy, patriarchy, patriarchy outside of a man, then taking a hammer and whapping him. I'm going to
This
beat
is
the heck out of
terrific.
patriarchy, but
Yeah.
in the process of beating patriarchy, you're killing the guy.
Hmm.
And that's what they're doing. They blame, and then they blame men for the patriarchy to begin with. It's all men's fault.
Right.
Oh,
This is
oh.
exactly what I was going to point out.
Sorry.
Why? No, no, terrific. This is a form of victim blaming. Why it's a form of victim blaming? Because A, it's assumed that men are responsible for perpetuating patriarchy, right?
Yes,
It's
yes,
also assumed that they benefit from patriarchy, and then
right.
it's assumed that patriarchy was responsible for all gender roles. Therefore, it's just like you said, a way of indirectly blaming the victim.
Yes, and that
And the
patriarchy
mistake of
also
victim.
hurts women. This is something that hurts women.
Right. I mean, and the reason
Oh,
we say blaming the victim specifically is because we're talking about prejudice against men. Even if, let's imagine it was true that patriarchy was responsible for all gender roles that affected women. Now it's the reason the person, this is what the part people want to focus in on. The only reason the person is mentioning it right now is a way of avoiding discussing the issue that's facing men.
yes.
If I say to you, men have been suffering for years because they're forced into the military or because they're forced to give up their dreams to provide as much possible for the family, and someone says, "Oh, this is patriarchy's fault." Okay, maybe it is and maybe it isn't, but what I'm talking about is the suffering people are experiencing, and you have successfully diverted the conversation
Exactly.
to an academic, philosophical. It's irrelevant. The point is, it's happening, right?
Yes.
Um,
And it's a
I
way to
actually
avoid the pain of men.
Hmm, exactly. I
Yeah.
actually asked this very question to someone who is in the APA Division 51
Uh
and who
oh.
will soon become the president. And I said he was just obsessed with not only studying masculinity, but obviously studying a negative view of masculinity. And this is the next section we're going to get into. But I asked him, even if you believe that masculinity is bad or patriarchy is bad and you want to stop it, why is that the only thing you research? Why is that the only thing you publish? What about all these other areas that are published by other journals, just not yours? And his response was, this is responsible for everything. If we fix this, every problem men face will go away, and every problem that men face is caused by this. I asked, do you have any evidence for this? And
How
he
dare
said,
you ask for
I
evidence?
just know it's true. It's just true. That's what he
Is that
said to me.
right? Oh my gosh.
So this is how even if there are people listening who aren't sold if patriarchy is good or bad, or if this broader definition is valid, the real thing you want to focus in on, remember, we're discussing the psychology of how prejudice against men is maintained in society. So whenever someone brings this up to you, unless that is specifically the topic of the conversation, if they just bring up patriarchy out of nowhere, it's a way to avoid talking about the actual experiences men are having and the
Yes.
prejudices.
Yes.
Just like if
Yes.
someone focuses on the word sexism, instead of the word prejudice, it's irrelevant. And then what I kind of led to is that the other form, it's actually more popular now. These things go in stages because every time there's a form of denial, and it gets rebuffed enough, they just come up with a new one. you know? First, men were bad in the 70s. Then patriarchy was the problem.
Yep.
Now masculinity is the problem.
Right.
Once people realize that that's also a smokescreen, someone will come up with something else to blame for all the problems and to avoid engagement with men's issues.
Right.
So yeah, definitely. Now the predominant theme of the APA's study about, we won't even say men's issues. They claim to study men, and they obsess only on this one topic of masculinity. And because of that, an idea has been spread in society that masculinity is bad, it's evil, and it's the cause of all the problems in the world. Um, Again, we already discussed patriarchy doesn't cause all the gender roles in the world, and neither does masculinity, right? So blaming things that have no relationship with each other is just a debate tactic, right?
Yes.
Um, it's definitely a form of blaming, victim blaming, even more than patriarchy, because masculinity is just a euphemism for the attributes and behaviors you observe from men, right?
Yeah. Yes.
How does anyone define what is masculinity? It's just
Toxic.
right. But even if before we even get into that, if someone even says, Because I was told that. I was told by the same individual who will be running the APA's division that we are interested in stopping masculinity, in not stopping. He said probably say studying or something masculinity, and this doesn't mean we're against men. So it's just a line. It's just a way of denial. Basically, people who victim blame often deny that they're victim blaming. And this is not specific to men. This is something you see in therapy all the time.
Yes, yes.
The first thing, it's kind of like if someone says, "No, I'm not racist," but they're probably about to say something racist, right? So, I'm not blaming so and so, but if they didn't X, Y, Z, so he directly denied that blaming masculinity is blaming men. But masculinity is just a euphemism, just defined by the behaviors you associate with men. So
Right.
it's a meaningless distinction that's just been made to continue blaming men, which was something started probably in the 1960s. But they keep changing the word, to keep the cycle going. Now, another thing that's happened recently is they've changed. First, there was toxic masculinity, like you said.
Right.
Now they thought, okay, so I want people to recognize how there's a pattern, how we're not discussing the actual issues at hand, but there's all these layers of psychology used to keep people quiet, to keep them subdued, to keep them almost obedient. And you can imagine that happens in many aspects of life. And these techniques are being used for this topic,
Yes.
not recognizing that men are experiencing prejudice, so they can keep this overall idea that prejudice is something only women experience out there. So you want to focus more on the techniques and the strategies. So you can see how first men were bad, then patriarchy was bad, now masculinity is bad. So first it was toxic masculinity. Then they said, "Oh, this is a bad term. We should update it." Every time you point out the something that's wrong, all they do is come up with a new way to attack. It's now become traditional masculinity.
It's true.
Oh, so if you were to say, I think it's not good to refer to masculinity as toxic or even parts of masculinity. Now people in this field will say, "Oh, I didn't say toxic. I said traditional,"
Right.
as if changing the word is relevant.
So much better.
Yeah, so much
Men
better.
are bad because of traditional masculinity.
Yeah, and in fact, this is worse, which is
Exactly.
ironic. It's
Exactly.
much worse. First of all, traditional implies it is all of masculinity and endorsed by most of men, because
Right.
that's what, at least before someone, people used to defend this by saying, "I'm not saying all of masculinity is bad, and just the toxic parts," right?
Right. Right.
But calling it traditional implies that it's a universal thing that almost all men accept in all cultures, etc.
Yes.
So it's even more victim blaming. I mean, the term traditional masculinity, if you were to ask an 8-year-old, he'd probably just say, "I don't know, the way men are." It's even worse. Um, Another aspect of this is that um, this is something that actually Tom has a wonderful article that he sent me a while back, which I feel like goes more in depth on this topic than I had actually written about. And there's this idea of how they even defined what they want to claim masculinity is, right? They're claiming, when you speak to someone who researches this topic, they will say, but there's empirical evidence that masculinity is correlated with such and such bad behaviors. But what Tom excellently writes in detail is that they made up this definition of masculinity completely out of thin air. When someone tells you masculinity, so the way psychology works is you come up with certain latent constructs like depression or openness, but we can't measure those with any device, with any gizmo, right? So we have to come up with questions and attributes and behaviors that we think are correlated. How many times did the person cry, and is the crying spells correlated with depression? You can't measure depression, so you can't measure someone's masculinity, right? You have to, what the psychologists, what they won't tell you, they want to say, "Oh, it's just correlated." First you have to ask what was correlated. So when they defined masculinity, they wrote out a bunch of negative characteristics like being dominant, being aggressive. They just listed a bunch of bad things.
Power
And
over
then
women.
what was that?
Power over women.
Yes, dominance over women, exactly.
Yeah, yeah,
And then they labeled this box of horrible things masculinity.
right, right.
So big surprise that your list of horrible attributes is correlated with other bad things, you know? It's all made up. Any psychologist who has a license, and honestly, I don't know if all of these people even do, because probably most of them aren't even clinical psychologists. But they will tell you that in order to create a sort of measurement technique, you need to create it using various techniques.
Right,
This was not designed using what's called empirical criterion keying, which is what this is a standard for when we want to make a psychological assessment. If you come in and I give you something called, for example, an MMPI is a very famous personality assessment,
right.
and certain questions are correlated with being depressed, being anxious. I know this because when they made the test in the first place, they designed they correlated certain questions to people who were already depressed. So this is empirical criterion keying. This wasn't used at all to make these so-called masculinity scales.
Right.
Also, they didn't survey men, a representative sample from the US, and say, what attributes do you associate with masculinity? They just made up completely out of thin air their negative stereotyped view of masculinity,
Yes.
called that masculinity, and then said conveniently it's correlated to all these other bad things. So definitely it's a form of victim blaming, because not only is masculinity a euphemism for men, but their view of what masculinity is literally defined by negative stereotypes that they want to blame men for having.
Exactly. Exactly.
Another interesting aspect of this study, the way they describe, blaming masculinity, is that when an attribute is, let's imagine there are certain attributes that are more likely to be displayed by men. Let's imagine that's true. If those attributes are negative, the person will call them negative attributes of masculinity. If those attributes are positive, they will say, we can't say they're masculine because that's insulting. It's implying women don't have those characteristics as well. Okay, then why didn't we say the same for the negative? If let's just take out of thin air, let's say leadership and aggression. These are stereotypical things, right? If I say, is leadership and bravery associated to masculinity, they will say, no, 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 this is a sexist thing. And then it's okay, but you said aggression and violence is associated. Oh, well, it's empirical. Well, the other one empirical as well. You can choose whichever logic you want, but they are flip-flopping between positive and negative.
Yes.
And then the inverse is done for measures of femininity. It's acceptable to say, oh, I have some survey that told me women are more likely to be nurturing. But if someone proposed a survey that showed that women are more likely to be vain, they would say this is inappropriate.
Yeah.
If it's inappropriate, that's fine. Then make it inappropriate for all these aspects.
Yes.
There's a kind of cherry picking in which attributes that may or may not, again, these things were not even measured. They weren't empirically defined as masculinity. But even if they were, they're only choosing negative male things and positive female things to put on their lists of masculinity and femininity.
Yes.
I know this may be getting technical and everything, so I hope it's not too much. There's actually, I don't want to overwhelm people, there's even more analyses of why masculinity is a form of victim blaming. I just want to touch on maybe one or two. One is that it, of course, encourages stereotyping, right? Instead of discouraging stereotyping, which is the job of a psychologist, they're encouraging people to say masculinity is the problem because masculinity is aggression and violence and all these things. Therefore, we should stop it.
Yep.
So therefore, you should keep thinking that masculinity is these bad things.
Yes.
It's also very ethnocentric. Very, if you look in they've recently published something called the Guidelines for Psychological Practice with Men and Boys. It may not be the exact title, but and it endorses a lot of these negative views. They have a one-line sort of token remark where they say traditional masculinity is defined by American, Western, blah, 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 like this. So they can claim it's not an ethnocentric depiction where they take Western views and project them on the whole world. But of course, after this, they will just use the word traditional masculinity and apply it to all men everywhere on earth, throughout time, in every culture. So it's a token way of claiming later on after the fact, oh, I wasn't stereotyping all men. But in practice, when you talk to people and you look at their research, they always say men are this, masculine is this. They don't say men in this location and this whatever, right?
Right. Right.
So it's a form of Orientalism where we have academics who are saying not only are American men like this, men in Pakistan must be the same way and worse. Men in Japan are even worse. They've never been to Pakistan. They don't know what life is like. But when I raise these issues, they say things that are quite racist and they don't think they are because they just assume that if the media presented a certain view of a certain culture, that these negative attributes I project onto men must be those other places are worse.
Right.
It's even
Right.
worse.
Right.
It's very ethnocentric.
Yes.
It's also a form of scientific sexism. I mean, kind of like we discussed a little bit before, how we're only focusing on attributes of masculinity or attributes of gender only become relevant when it's a negative thing about men, right?
Right.
The APA recently released like a whole letter essentially apologizing and admitting to decades of scientific racism, right? This is how we mentioned earlier in the talk, how you shouldn't trust things just because the government says so or because academics say things. It doesn't
Right.
make them right. You
Right.
shouldn't trust what I say just because I'm telling you. Read the document I wrote, read other things, and use your own mind.
Yes.
But just because academics say a thing, and this is a great proof, the APA is admitting that all the things they said in the past were racist, right? But yet it's impossible for them to be doing prejudice things, endorsing prejudice concepts against men right now. So a form of scientific sexism is when negative traits of men are seen as masculinity, and it becomes okay to analyze stereotypes about a person's gender only in a certain circumstance, and you use those things to kind of create a story, elaborate thing. For example, I could easily list a bunch of racist attributes. I could say my definition of black culture is criminal behavior, is rudeness, is swear words, and then I could define this in a made up way as black culture, and then I could associate this to the likelihood of being incarcerated. This would be definitely considered scientific racism, and it is. But this is exactly what people used to do. This was very common in the past, that they would only start to correlate behaviors to race when they were highlighting negative things that were maybe more proportionate in the black community,
Hmm.
right? A very
Hmm.
convenient system of analysis that
Yes.
was used for a specific purpose.
Yes.
And it's definitely bad, and it's accepted that it was happening, and now the AP has apologized for it. So doing the same thing for men is, very rampant right now, and it's just so
And
we
they
should we
can't
should
see it.
do this. So it's I know this is a lot of information, but it's sort of a way to view the topic. Sometimes people imagine like there was actually one person who wrote a comment on our last video, and I just noticed it this morning, and he said that he was talking to a woman about biases in the court, and the woman was refusing to acknowledge there could be any negative bias towards men. And he said it was weird because that same woman was currently helping a man who was having his children taken away from him because he was having being accused of things he didn't do. And
Yep.
that very woman was testifying on his behalf. But yet she
Couldn't see
refused to
it.
acknowledge that there could be
Right.
some sort of prejudice going on.
Right. Right.
So he was thinking to himself, I don't get it. Why is she like this? So my point is psychology is sort of there to help you answer that question. Why are people like this?
Yes.
This is why I became a psychologist. Why is it that a person is doing a certain thing, but they're saying another thing? Why is it that a person is acting a certain way? This is what therapy is all about.
Yes.
I don't know why I get angry at my partner so much. Can you help me figure it out? Stuff like this. Why do my
Yes.
relationships fall apart? What am I doing wrong? So we want to frame whenever we're looking at instances of prejudice against men, not as if they are isolated individual instances, and not as though the person is genuinely open-minded but is behaving way in a confusing way. We want to frame it as a global system of prejudice and everything that we view is coming through this filter.
Yes.
I don't know the woman, but in a nutshell, she wasn't endorsing it because she uh, refuses to acknowledge that men can be victims of prejudice in a nutshell. And the
Yes.
denial of victimhood is one of the examples, one of the types of prejudice. So if someone my point is he could sort of understand why she's doing it. He has this confusion like why won't she acknowledge it, We don't say that about, for example, people in the 1950s who were forcing, African Americans to sit in a certain place and do a certain thing. We just say they were racist, We don't interpret it as, "Oh, I'm confused," We have an explanation. The explanation is that people are prejudiced.
Yes.
So it's like we're refusing to acknowledge that this overall global filter is on people.
Yes.
And then we're confused why certain things happen in the world. So we should sort of look at all these instances from this global view that you're talking about masculinity is bad. You know what? You're just prejudice. You're talking
Yes.
about patriarchy is bad. You know what? This is just a form of prejudice. You're
There you
blaming the
go.
victim. I'm not going to engage with you. This is blaming the victim. You're wrong. This is prejudice. Instead of getting pulled into these complex conversations that are a way of avoiding the issue.
And you just summed up exactly what we've been talking about, and the whole idea of responding to people in that way,
Mm,
and detach, detach, detach. And I think you're so right. This is a large system that is set up, and we need to take it one little teaspoon at a time.
mm,
One little teaspoon at a time. Stay detached, but keep calling things out.
mm,
And I got to thank you, Aman, for the work you've done. I mean, it's just amazing what you've chronicled in this dissertation. And guys, we've probably only talked about 20 or 30 pages today. And the thing's 500 pages long. I mean, there's so much depth in this thing. It's just incredible. And you're literally mapping out how things are set up against men. And it's really helpful to men to learn these things because then we can start to respond in
mm,
more productive kinds of ways rather than just pull our hair out and get upset and get pissed off. You know, we need to start responding in rational ways and say, no, that's silly. That's not connected. That's not
mm.
men's pain. Let's talk about men's pain. You
Hmm.
know. So are we about finished?
Yeah, definitely.
Is there anything else you'd like to add before we go?
I hope we didn't get too technical today,
I
and
think it was perfect. I think it was perfect.
hopefully there's a lot more we can discuss, and there's
Oh,
probably a lot of
trust me.
questions people have, but we're just going at a step at a time, so we don't cram it all into one big
Yes. Yeah, there you
thing.
go. And there's a huge amount to discuss, and I'm looking forward to doing more of it. And I think you need to turn this thing into a book, self-help
Mm,
book. I think for relationships, people could read this kind of thing together and understand their own communication so much better, if they know how these
mm,
mechanisms work that underlie this
mm.
prejudice. It's fascinating.
On
Anyway,
that on that topic, real quick, just to mention that, unfortunately, whenever people talk about men's or just men in general in the psychology community, they usually
yeah,
just obsess over masculinity because
yeah,
that's what the EAP told them, right?
yeah.
And I've heard from people who were in those lectures, what was the point of that? They come out and they say, I thought I was going to learn how to help male clients in therapy, and all they
Right.
did talk about is what is masculinity the whole time.
Yes,
And when
exactly.
I give a talk, I do exactly what you just said. I highlight issues that men may be facing, why they may be facing it. I use a very male positive approach. If I'm helping a certain male client learn more about his emotions, I frame it as, you know what, this is not your fault. Everyone needs to learn how to understand their emotions better. This is a skill. And that
Yes,
men are being discriminated against. They are not being given this opportunity.
yes,
And if you go through with me for the next few months, you can learn this. And it's
yes,
very successful. And what's more important is that when I tell other therapists this, they're like, that's terrific. I'm glad I heard about that.
yes.
So they're eager for this information.
Men are very, very able to articulate and to be open and honest if they have a safe place.
Hmm,
Most of the places in the world for men are not safe.
hmm,
So men are not going to go out and emote in public because they know it's not a safe place. But if you can create a container for a man in therapy, boom, he'll open up like crazy.
hmm.
Because he knows you're safe. It's just Just the way it is. Indeed. So that's good. Aman, thanks again, man. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you again soon. And let's end by saying men are good,
Good.
as are you. We'll see you then. Bye-bye. Men are good, as are you.